again, Happy New Year to all of my book lovers. Happy 2022. I'm going to be making a video today all about my favorite books that I read in 2021. I think I read 48 books this year, and I made a complete list of all of the books that I read this year, ranking them in order of favorite to least favorite. So I know a lot of people, when they make books of their favorite, or make videos of their favorite books, they always say like, in no particular order. No, this is a particular order. I will be very harsh in my judgments, but I'm not saying that this is the definitive order. I always, make the disclaimer that when I rank my books every year, it's not a list of how good I think the books are. Actually, if I had to objectively rank books in how good of a book I thought it was, I could probably do that too. But that doesn't sound as fun to me. I would rather rank books and judge books based on my own personal enjoyment of them. So this is going to be a list of my favorite books that I read this year in order. So I'll start with my favorite book / book series that I read this year, and that is The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. Holly Black is maybe my favorite author, or at least has a very, very special place in my heart. So I don't know if it's sometimes even fair for me to put her books up against other people's, because there's a lot of nostalgia mixed in with how I feel about Holly Black. Even when I ranked the books that I read this year, I didn't include the first 3 Harry Potter books because there's too much nostalgia for those for me to put them in competition with other books. But this series is one that I had not read until this year, and it was so incredible. Especially the first book. The first book was my favorite one of the trilogy. So it's the Folk of the Air trilogy. The Cruel Prince was amazing. It's so atmospheric. Holly Black just writes the best fairy worlds ever, and she commits, even though she writes in a low fantasy world wherein, our world and the human world still exists and fairy world still exists, she really, really commits to her worlds, which sometimes it's a pet peeve of mine when fantasy authors don't commit strong enough to their world and will bring up stuff that doesn't make sense, or they'll have a high fantasy world and yet use, terminology or include things that really doesn't make sense for those things to exist in that world. Holly Black kind of avoids this by having her fairy world be set in a low fantasy realm. So it's okay for human elements to come up. In fact, her other fairy books are usually set in the mortal world, and then fairy elements come into it. This is her first book series that really takes place in the fairy world, and I love her for that. Thank you. I needed that so desperately. This world is incredible. All of her descriptions are just so lush and amazing. You get a horrible bad boy character to just fall in love with, the wounded bad boy. It's fantastic, with one of the strongest female leads I have ever read. She might be one of my favorite female protagonists of all time. Her and Cersei, probably, are the two top. They're competing it out. And her name is Jude, and she's incredible. So if any of those things sound appealing to you, if a fairy world, amazing atmosphere, low fantasy, really strong female protagonists, and a classic wounded dark-haired bad boy love interest, then please please enjoy. I know some people, also a disclaimer, some people would categorize this as a hot or spicy book. I feel the romance has some heat to it, because there's a lot of tension. Anytime there's enemies to lovers, that's gonna be a factor. But no, it's not spicy. So it is still classified as YA. It's not new adult. So yeah, if you're going into this book hoping for something like really, really steamy, you're not going to get it, but you're going to get like heat and passion and tension, which is arguably just as good. I've read a lot of spicy books this year, and this one's still my favorite. So, number 1. Not often do I go into reading a book expecting it to be a favorite of all time, but that is how I felt about The House in the Cerulean Sea. So I had this on my books that I wanted to read before the end of the year. I succeeded in reading it. Me and a few of my friends from my education degree have a book club, and this was my pick for the book that we would read. And we just had such great discussions about it, like getting so into the characters. You know, I'm like making notes on my phone the whole time we were reading it. And we had such a good time reading this book. So much so that one of my friends said it was her favorite book that she's ever read, to which high praise. If I can find a book for someone that they can enjoy, I feel good. But I'm going to be writing that compliment forever. Like, the idea that I could give someone a book and then it becomes their favorite book of all time, that's amazing. So you also might want to check out this book. The House in the Cerulean Sea is a standalone fantasy novel, kind of low fantasy in that it definitely takes place in a world that is maybe like modern adjacent. Like it's incredibly similar to our world, but just with like fantastical elements. So maybe magical realism would be a better category to put this book into. But such lovable characters. The found family is incredible. This is a very character-driven novel. If you want something to read to feel good, this is the book for you. It's just so heartfelt and wonderful. And I didn't know a lot about it going in, and I think that you shouldn't either. I would just tell you the main character, Linus, works for a part of the government that's kind of the equivalent of social services, but in charge of magical youth. So he has to go around to orphanages, which is where all like magical youths are usually taken to, which, you know, they get into that in the book. And he has to assess whether or not he thinks these environments are suitable for them. Sometimes he like has to shut these orphanages down. And he is sent on a very special top secret mission to one such orphanage that is even more special than all the rest. So please read this book and enjoy it. Another book/book series that is on my favorite things that I've read this year is the 5th season specifically is book 1 of the Broken Earth trilogy. This one I choose to hold up, not just because it's the first book, because it is also my favorite. The other ones I didn't love as much, but I loved it, you know, for being the continuation of this story. N.K. Jemisin is an amazing writer, and I will continue to read anything that she writes. This is kind of like a sci-fi fantasy amalgamation. It's basically taking place in this fictional world wherein there's constant seismic activity. So there's always like earthquakes and like volcanic eruptions and things like that. And so it's a very, very dangerous world. And there are certain people called origines who are able to control seismic activity. But weirdly, instead of these people being like revered and like held high on a pinnacle, or on a pedestal, I'm sorry, they're really ostracized, and they are taken and isolated and taught to control their powers for the service of the government. They're thought of kind of like witches in a way, you know, that kind of social ostracization. And they generally aren't allowed to mix in with the rest of the population. This book follows 3 female characters. One point of view of which is written in second person, which is a really different decision and a very hard thing to do, especially in a novel, to write as though you are the person doing everything and experience everything. but she does a really good job of this. And basically it explores all the politics that's happening in this world as pretty much the world is ending. So the book begins, or around the beginning of the book, there's this crazy cataclysmic event wherein a new season will be starting. So a season usually happens when some kind of like great seismic activity happens, wherein people, have to hunker down and get through it. This is going to be the last one. This is going to be the kind of 5th season that ends everything. So we have that all happening in the background as we explore these characters and also kind of like the history leading up to this event. I would not necessarily recommend this book to people who don't already enjoy fantasy and sci-fi. Like, it's a really, really good book, and especially if that's a genre that you like, I would highly recommend it, but it does not shy away from some of like the fantasy elements that can bog a lot of people down, which is like changing perspectives, lots of characters, lots of terminology, piecing things together so that like you as the reader you are not being spoon-fed things. Like, you in your mind have to figure out, okay, like what's happening here, like someone mentioned this thing and that connects to something else, and it's like that tapestry being woven that at the end comes together so that you can see the bigger picture. So really rewarding, but maybe frustrating for people who aren't used to that kind of narrative. This Is How You Lose the Time War was an absolutely wonderful book that, again, was also very atmospheric, had very beautiful writing. I mentioned this book before. It is a story, a love story, a very unconventional love story between Red and Blue, who are two women on opposing sides of a time war. So, like, constantly throughout the book, these characters will be at different moments in history. They're really playing the long game. That is what the time war is. It rages for centuries, for millennia, and these characters are deeply entrenched within it. And what starts out as maybe kind of a taunt and secretly like a desperate bid for connection ends in a like torrid like love affair that of like two souls who are just like trying to connect with one another. So it's very, very beautiful, very like mood inducing, I would say. It's definitely a book, it's a short book that I would put on like some background music to read. No words or anything like that, but just like some very like moody background music to listen to while reading this book. That's what I did halfway through, and it made it even better because the prose of this book are just written in such a beautiful way. I mean, one of the authors is a poet, that it just pairs so well with like music and creating that atmosphere. So I would really recommend it if any of those things sound appealing to you. One book that I read this year that I really was not expecting to love as much as I did is The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. It is a YA contemporary story written in verse, and I read it because I think like some students had recommended it, or I like saw a copy in the classroom and knew that it was a book that sometimes like other teachers teach in their classes. I was like, I'll give this book a shot, and enjoyed it so much. It's just so far removed from the kinds of books that I usually read, and I enjoyed it immensely, especially like the main character's relationship with her mother. That was something that I loved so much. So it's this young girl who is really like struggling with her coming of age. She lives in a very religious household with a twin brother who, you know, is kind of like a prodigy, is so smart. He's a boy. He is encouraged to do all of these things, and her as a woman from, I think her mother is Cuban, from like a Cuban household that is also deeply religious. There are so many different expectations put on her as a young woman. But she has regular like needs and desires and wants. She's turning into a woman, and she's made to feel like so ashamed of her sexuality, and almost like afraid of it, but she senses also like how powerful it can be, while at the same time she is discovering poetry and music and boys and love, and like really like pushing against her mother, who is the antagonist of the story really, and how she can become, you know, an independent person while being so at odds with the main female role model in her life. And it's so incredible. Like I said, it's written in verse, so there's like some really beautiful lines. I did not listen to it as an audiobook, but I would definitely recommend to do that. I got to listen to, you know, a couple pages of it, and the author, Elizabeth Acevedo, who is a poet, obviously narrates it, and oh my god, it's so good. So highly recommend. The next book I'm going to talk about is also of a genre that I don't typically read, which is contemporary. Is something that I'm trying to get more into, and so I read A Man Called Ove, or sometimes pronounced A Man Called Ove, by Fredrik Backman. It's a book originally written in Swedish. Fredrik Backman is a really popular contemporary author right now. I see his book Beartown at school a lot, and I just know that he's a really lovely author for writing really different stories that maybe you don't get to hear that often. And he has a really keen insight into the human heart. I lent this book to my mom knowing that she was going to love it, and she kept putting it off, or I think she read the first chapter and she wasn't super into it. I was like, no, you have to keep going, get into it. And then she read the rest of it in 2 days and cried and loved it so much, and now she knows to take my recommendations. So this book is about the grumpiest, most cantankerous man you could ever imagine. So the grumpy old man archetype is Ove, and he at the same time is so delightful because he just rags on everything and he hates everything except for, you know, these few things in life that he values and cares about. And I think that that is a really relatable situation to be in, where a lot of the time we have like this inner monologue, this, you know, very like grumpy and judgy monologue. He just lets his be an outward monologue, and we get to learn about his life and basically the circumstances that have led him to this point, which this is not a spoiler alert, because it happens in like the very first chapter of the story, which is him not wanting to be alive anymore. And we kind of get to explore his life and also, you know, what his life could be. So I feel like it almost has like an It's a Wonderful Life kind of feel to it, wherein, you know, someone is just so done. They're so done, but they're, through the course of the narrative, we get to see like more beauty in the world, and we get to learn a lot more about what drives a person to feel that way. So yeah, it's a really lovely story, and I think it would appeal to a lot of people, and especially people who aren't super into fantasy or sci-fi, because I realize that my recommendations definitely skew in that direction. So this is a contemporary novel that I can really recommend. A book that I read this year that I feel like I've talked about a lot is Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. It's just a really great fantasy book. It's a YA high fantasy, so, you know, completely new world, gorgeous like magic and world building, but is also really easy to read, lots of fun characters, fun relationships, there's a romance. It's just a really, really great book, and again, is very atmospheric. That seems to be what I'm going for a lot this year. A lot of the books that I have enjoyed, I would definitely describe as being atmospheric, and I have. So this book I feel like I have talked about enough, but for anyone who is trying to get into high fantasy, I think this could be a really good introduction to that. It's a duology also, so there's this book and then the second one, which is Muse of Nightmares, which I did really love. It really should just be like one big book because like they just completely lead one into the other. So I enjoyed this one more. Didn't so much love the ending / beginning of Muse of Nightmares, but loved the overall ending and conclusion of the duology. So really enjoyed this book. So much of my reading this year has been taken up with falling back in love with manga. So I have been reading a lot of manga, I've been watching a lot of manga. I don't always record the manga that I read, including it in my reading log, as it were. I'm sure if I included all the manga that I've read, I would have read over 100 books, I'm sure. But I don't always include it. I rarely include it in tracking the books that I read. Especially because I read a lot of it online. But oh my god, it's been so enjoyable to read these stories. I've been reading especially a lot of romances, like fluffy shoujo romances. Love that. Been reading like some fantasy-esque. Like everything is always a romance though. I am loving manga romances. And one romance that I have read that I've probably enjoyed the most is an online webcomic. It's a manhwa, actually, which is like a Korean manga, called Semantic Error. So this is a BL manga, for anyone who's not familiar. That means boys love. So it's a gay romance. But oh my god, it's so good. It is such a good enemies to lovers story. It is between two characters. God, I forget both their names right now. But one of which is let's be real, he is definitely like on the autism spectrum. He very much struggles with like communication. He looks at the world in a very analytical way. He has a lot of like compulsions and way that he needs to organize his world in order for it to make sense. And people don't really make sense to him, but like math and computers and things like that does. That is his fixation. So he loves video games. He wants to be like a video game engineer, and he's in university doing computer science, and he wants to, I don't know if it's for a project or just like for an independent portfolio that he's working on, he wants to make like a small video game, like an app video game. And so he needs to hire someone to do the artwork for it. And so at university, what do? You find other people in other programs. So he's looking to someone else that he has worked with in the past to partner up to do this. She is unavailable, and so she recommends him someone else. Come to meet the other figure in this story, who is an art student. He is, loud and fun and like kind of a bad boy, kind of rebellious. And it turns out that they have met because they were in a class together and put in a group project. The really analytical guy ended up having to do all of the work for that project because all three other participants gave him like half-assed excuses as to why they weren't available and just pretty much expected him to be like the grunt doing all the work, and that they would all get the same grade. He did not feel that this was right, and so only put his name on the presentation and let the other people fail. Our fun artsy guy ended up failing that class because of him and then couldn't graduate when he was supposed to because of analytical guy. So next thing you know, they meet at this meeting only to realize that they are like the person that he thinks he's the person who screwed him over, all these things. And so artsy guy swears to take revenge. He says, I have nothing but time. I'm having to retake that course that I failed because of you, and that's the only course I'm taking, so guess what? I'm just going to follow you around and go to all of your courses and bother you and disrupt your routine. So he's going to do anything he can to bother our analytical guy, which is, just things like buying all of the specific brand of coffee that he always gets, or taking the seat that he always sits in every class. And that is his goal in life, is to ignore this character. So, of course, gradually through this, they get to know each other. There's lots of like headbutting moments, but they also have like some connection moments, and an attraction forms, one that neither one of them can really explain. And it's just so good. And it's basically them like trying to deal with the way that they're feeling about each other, especially coming at it from very different angles. So artsy guy is like, oh yeah, like, okay, I hate being attracted to you, but I guess I am. Like, let's just like deal with it head on. Versus analytical guy who's like, I don't know why I'm attracted to you. Don't like it. I'm just gonna continue to ignore this. So it's just a really, really fun story, and it's still ongoing, which is so frustrating. Like, I thought it sucked when you're reading a book series and, you finish a book in the series and then you have to, wait for the next book to come out. Imagine waiting for it chapter by chapter. That is what these webcomics do to us, and it's so frustrating. So if that sounds like something fun that you would enjoy to read, it's called Semantic Error, and if you Google Semantic Error, read online, I'm sure you can find it to read, and it's really good and really fun. And finally, another book series, kind of a book series. I read three of the series. It's the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. I read the first one in 2020, read Mist and Fury, Wings and Ruin, and Silver Flames all in 2021. Enjoyed them all. If I had to rank them, I would put Silver Flames, Mist of Fury, Wings and Ruin as my rankings for the ones that I read this year. Silver Flames, again, this is another book that I've talked about that I just love so much because of the perfect level of like tension and spice and enemies to lovers. I just really enjoy it. I did love Mist and Fury, which I feel is the most popular one in the series, but I just can't with Feyre. Sometimes she annoys me, like when a character is just like too perfect and like too good at everything and everyone inexplicably likes them right away, and I don't know, whereas like Nesta, we're not supposed to like her. She has deep flaws. If anything, I think that's a better story of us falling in love with a character who we weren't supposed to like. And so I enjoyed Silver Flames the most out of the books in the ACOTAR series. Like I have said before, plot is whatever, but I feel like that's the case with most of those series. But you read it for the characters. You read it for the characters, you read it for the spice, you read it for the fun. Like, they're just fun books to read, and I think almost anyone could read them, and for that reason, they're a really good introduction to fantasy for, like, adult readers who don't want to be, like, bogged down in too much of the details. So if you're someone who likes romance especially, or likes, like, heat and spice, then this book series is a great way to also get into fantasy. I'll also throw out an honorable mention to two other, mangas or webcomics that I have read this year that I've really enjoyed. I am still working my way through the manga of Fruits Basket. I finished the anime and enjoyed it so much. Kyo is still one of my favorite characters of all time. And then I've been reading Lore Olympus, which you can read online, or now they've published it into an actual physical book. I've read it all online, but I will definitely be getting the physical book. It's a Hades and Persephone retelling. Hades is just so amazing. All of the characters are so fun. The art style is amazing. They all have like very fun and different colored like skin tones, like pink and blue and purples and greens. And it's just very visually pleasing. So I would definitely recommend that as like such a fun story. I've gotten my sister, my partner, a bunch of other people to start reading it, and it's a lot of fun. So that's it for my favorite books of 2021. I'm going to be coming out with another video of maybe some like reading goals or books that I want to read in 2022. But if you have read any of these books, I would love to know, or especially if you didn't like any of the books that were my favorite of the year, please tell me. Also, I am taking recommendations for books that I should read in 2022, so please leave a comment with that.